Hi, my name is Bijal Shah and I am a bibliotherapist and founder of Book Therapy, a bibliotherapy and literary curation practice. I'm also the author of the book Bibliotherapy, The Healing Power of Reading. I curate book prescriptions and provide online training in bibliotherapy. More detail of this can be found on my website, www.booktherapy.io. In this podcast, I share my knowledge and research on bibliotherapy, including the latest developments, science, and book recommendations. Join me every week where we take a deep dive into bibliotherapy. We release 2 episodes a week. Voice notes from me, your resident bibliotherapist, and Ask the Bibliotherapist, book recommendations for what's on your mind. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you'd like a bibliotherapist in your pocket, you might find my book, Bibliotherapy, The Healing Power of Reading, a helpful companion. It's available at any bookstore that you shop at. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and get new episodes as they're released. And as always, I love hearing from listeners. So if you'd like to get in touch, share any book recommendations or thoughts on bibliotherapy, you can do so at bijal@booktherapy.io. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to Bibliotherapy with Bijal Shah. In this episode, I have Theresa Lola, an award-winning poet and published author, and she shares her journey from growing up in Nigeria to becoming a published poet in the UK. She has performed at the ICA, the Royal Albert Hall, and Jazz Cafe, and a poem from her first book, In Search of Equilibrium, is studied in the UK's GCSE syllabus, while her second poetry collection, Ceremony for the Nameless, won the 2025 Derek Walcott Poetry Prize. Theresa is also the founder of the lifestyle brand Your Envoi, where she infuses creativity into wellness stationery. In this episode, she discusses her fascination with poetry, especially grief poetry, and how it helps in processing complex emotions. Theresa delves into her creative process, the power of language, and how her cultural heritage shapes her work. The conversation also covers her initiatives, like creative writing workshops for mental health, and her new stationery brand, Your Envoi, designed to foster self-reflection and connection. This episode highlights the therapeutic potential of poetry and creative expression. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Theresa. It's so lovely to have you here today with us. And I'm so excited to talk about some of your poetry, especially the grief poetry aspects, which I think is going to be really helpful for my listeners today. Before we begin, it would be nice for my listeners to know a little bit about you and your journey as a poet, including where you grew up and how you progressed to becoming a published Penguin author.
Yeah, hi. So lovely to be here and to chat with you. I love what you do. So I'm really happy that we can talk a bit more about literature and mental health and all of these things. And yeah, a bit about me. I was born in Nigeria, which is where I grew up. And I'd had an interest in writing from when I was young. I wouldn't pay attention in class and I'll be writing scripts, imagining that they will be brought to life in Hollywood. And this is when I was in year 3. So I was
Oh,
probably like
wow.
8 years old.
So
But I
very
did
young.
I
Yes.
know very young, but my mum loved reading and we had a library at home and she always made sure I had a book in my bag. So just being lost in that world of imagination was something that I loved. And this idea that these characters weren't real, but they were very real to me. They were going through real emotions and real experiences. But I went on a school trip to a poetry festival when I was in secondary school. And that was when I decided I was going to be a poet. There was something about language compressed that just absolutely fascinated me. I loved stories, characters in them, and going through a very clear journey. But poetry just offered me this room to experiment in a way that I hadn't seen. Not necessarily have to describe an emotion, describe an experience, but just being able to feel it in the body and allow others to do the same. When you're a teenager and you're going through experiences that you can't necessarily describe, I felt that poetry would better help me write that as opposed to a story. I didn't understand the kind of things I was experiencing at that time, and poetry just gave shape to that. And yeah, I moved to the UK when I was 13. And I was still writing, but the idea of being a published poet just really wasn't something I thought was possible. It seemed quite far away for me.
Because you were published quite young. But
Yeah. Do you know what's funny? Because I remember being young and people would say to me, "You're quite young," but as someone who was just really hungry to have her voice heard, that wasn't a compliment from me. It was like, no, I want to be published now. So even that felt quite late, but I guess that's just when you're young and you just really want to share your work with others. I just love poetry so much that I wanted to contribute to the canon of poetry, which I guess when you're 21 feels like a big task, but it was exciting for me. I studied accounting and finance in uni, but then I knew when I was in uni and I started thinking about what do I want to do with my life. I knew that my purpose was in writing, and that was when I went back to it. So when I came out of uni, I did the Barbican Young Poets program, which is a poetry program run by the Barbican Centre. And that was just how my career took off. I built a network of poets there, and then I entered a poetry slam run by Hammer and Tongue, and the winner was announced at Royal Albert Hall, and I won it. That was how it started.
that's fascinating. And also because your journey began in accounting and finance, which really resonates with me because I studied mathematics and now I've gone into literature. So I feel that there's something about both sides of the brain that we want to bring together. So we were drawn to the language of maths, but then we were also eventually drawn more to the creative side. And in fact, I think there's even a book out on maths and creativity. There's a real
Mm.
link to why people end up doing these little pivots. So it's fascinating, and I completely resonate with that desire to use words and language to capture your experience. And you're absolutely right. I feel poetry really captures emotions in a way that sometimes prose struggles to, because it's very much about showing, not telling. And I feel that
Yeah.
poetry is very good at that. And it's very immediate in the sense of giving you access to an emotion that you're feeling and being able to share that with the reader. If you're writing the poetry, or if you've got readers reading the poetry, they've also got very immediate access to what you're feeling through the power of metaphor and symbolism. So I feel poetry is definitely a very good medium for that. And I can 100% understand why you're drawn to it. In bibliotherapy, I tend to use a lot of poetry therapy. When I'm feeling really low, or I need to figure something out, or I really need to express myself, rather than journaling, I'll often go to poetry. So when you said that that was something that really struck a chord with you, I think I've had a very similar experience to that. So you grew up in Lagos in Nigeria, and then you came to the UK for university, or
No, no, secondary school. So I was
secondary
13 when
school?
I came, year nine at the
Oh,
time.
it's interesting because your poetry is so focused on identity, and I wonder if that experience living in two different worlds, cultural worlds, drew you to writing more about identity and memory and belonging. And I'm quite curious how your experiences as a British Nigerian have shaped your voice on the page.
I think when you're starting off writing about this, and this was the case for me, you naturally are drawn to the theme of displacement. But
Yeah.
as I've grown as a writer, I find that is there and that is the underlying theme there. For example, when I think about Nigerian poetry, that aspect of storytelling
Yeah.
and musicality is very much in there. And that's something I'm trying to bring back into my work as much as possible. So I find that in my work, I'm using a lot of repetition and alliteration, anaphora, these things of emphasizing a point almost to the point of it being music in the body. It's almost like bringing in the spirit of like Nigerian literary landscape in my work, even if I'm writing about an experience that is set here. So it's like
Yeah.
bringing in that voice to talk about an experience here. So I see those two identities almost like my two eyes. And I see with both eyes. If I look at family, for example, I inevitably view it with both eyes. What is family like here? What are the conditions that affect the ways family live here in the UK? But also, how is family seen in Nigeria? In my culture,
Yeah.
family is everything. A man's wealth is based on how many children you have and those kind of things. Yes, how can I bring in those things to make the poem a bit more complex? So rather than going in with, I'm going to write about displacement, I want to write about my grandfather's dementia. I want to write about how do these two identities complicate, or what layers do those add to how I experience that grief.
And I don't know if you think about your poetry in a different language in Nigerian and then almost translate that into English or vice versa, because I feel like you also experience things differently in two different languages, the same experience. But if you then translate that one experience into English, for example, does it directly capture the exact essence of it, or is it changed by the language that you're translating that experience into, for example?
Nigeria, there's 200 languages. And
Oh
Yoruba is
gosh,
my culture
wow.
and it's the language that I should know, but I
Yeah,
can't actually speak Yoruba fluently. So
right.
I've not had the experience of having to write in Yoruba and translate into English. But I did a project where I had a poem in English and my mum translated it to Yoruba for me. But her translating my poem into Yoruba made me realize it's almost like a whole new poem being created when you translate something to a whole other language. The
Yes,
poem I'd
yes.
written was very subdued and it was about feeling like I wasn't living up to the legacy of the women in my family. And it was very somber. But when she read it, it almost seemed like a celebratory poem. I didn't understand it, but it's because even the sound of the language gives rise to certain kinds of emotion. So it was a lot more dramatic and a lot more filled with a lot more frustration, while in the English version, it was really quiet.
For me, when I'm thinking in my native language of Gujarati, I feel very positive about all my experiences in my language. I don't know why. I think it's because
Mm.
it's a very naturally positive language and a very sort of can-do language when I'm thinking Gujarati. And then when I bring that into English, I feel that I've got lots of different emotions. I find myself sometimes entering into more of a negative self-talk, which is really bizarre. Maybe because English has more expressions for things. It's a
Mm.
larger language. There's more words for expression. So it's interesting how maybe Gujarati restricts me in terms of this is the only way I can express it because it's only got a positive structure of phrasing things. So it's interesting how the development of language and the evolution of language can all of a sudden start to capture more and more things that maybe we weren't aware of, maybe we didn't even know it was an issue. And now all of a sudden we have a word for something or a label for something.
Yeah,
And
that's
now it's really raising your awareness and then tugging into different emotions, which can be a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, hands
So,
down. You make some really interesting points. I remember speaking to someone and asking them, what language do you dream in? And I think that the amount of control we think we have over language really informs how we feel when we write in that language. So,
yeah.
yeah, like a sort of fluency, or I think about people who maybe for colonial reasons, English is something that they experience tension with as they write in. That's something that will come across when you write. So for people that speak different languages, maybe like what language do you dream in is probably the language that you can express yourself the most in when
Yes.
you write.
Yes,
Um,
that's right.
yeah.
And like, for example, when I'm going through a really difficult day, I will enter into prayer, but in Gujarati, the prayers that I've learned when I was younger. And that just brings me the most
Mm.
comfort because maybe that is just more familiar than the English language, but it's just that immediacy to home and childhood and family and that safety that I had around my grandparents, etc. And that's why I think one of your poems, I think it's called My Name is My
My
Home.
name is my home, yes.
Yeah, that one really resonated with me because I thought so much in what our names can mean to us. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on what that poem meant to you and why you wrote it, because it really resonated with me.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if there's time, but I'm happy to read it or just talk about it, whichever you prefer.
Yes, I think maybe we can read it because I think it's a lovely poem if you're okay to share it.
Yeah, sure, of course. So, my name is my home. Ilé là ń wò kí a tó sọ ọmọ lórúkọ. The Yoruba proverb translates to, you do not name a child unless you know the condition of the home into which they are born. Every time someone mispronounces my name, they break its windows, dirty the floors, replace things, take things. In a secondary school in Bromley, my Yoruba name pronounced Fumi is bent into Funmi, and so are the house rules. They enter my name with a litter of confetti. In a different school, a girl calls me Fanny, claims it sounds similar. I don't resist. Watch her strip clothes from my room, her small hand splinter my wardrobe back to a wooden idea. In another school, I remove the N in the spelling of my name. Mistake what is subtle for what is silent. Go by Fumi instead of Fumi. Then I remember what the letter N means to my skin folk, the weapon-shaped word it carries. So I grab the N back and feel the roof inside my name reposition itself. At university, I switch to my middle name, but graduation reveals our full names. Make sure our true selves are awarded. On this day, my full name, Olufomilola, meaning Olu, God, Fun, give, me, Ola, wealth, is twisted into Olu, funny Ola, by a lecturer. The staircase inside my name flattens into a trampoline, alters the way my prayers reach for height. Every time someone mispronounces my name, they disrupt its foundations, replace things, break things. Now I'm left with no choice but to build spike gates, position armed guards. I must shield my name.
Wow. That is so powerful. And it's so nice to learn your Nigerian name as well, which is Olufemi Lola. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, that's yeah.
And God-given wealth, is that right?
Yes, God has
Yeah.
given me wealth. Yeah.
Oh, and God has given you wealth,
Uh,
particularly with all your amazing
Amen.
language that you're bringing to us in these beautiful forms of the poetry that you've written.
Thank you so much for the kind words about this poem. It's funny because this was the first poem that made me realize that the collection was going to be about names. I hadn't really realized it up till this point that this was the poem that had the most urgency, and there were things, unresolved things about my name that I hadn't really explored. But it wasn't really about the name itself. It was about identity, and it was about this space in my life where I was trying to figure out who I was, and the idea of Teresa. Like, Teresa is my middle name, and Lola is an ending of my first name. But a lot of people assumed it was my surname, but it was just that I just had to reroute myself of who am I. And so the concept of using home as that metaphor, and what I love about poetry was I didn't have to write a poem so rawly asking, who am I? Why did I change my name? Why am I not going by my Yoruba name? But poetry just gave me that safe space to embrace, hold two ideas in one image. So the home as embracing and celebrating this Yoruba name is something that connects me to heritage, something that connects me to my origins, something that makes me feel safe, while also in that same vein exploring how it's been broken into and shifted and changed. And the idea of the staircase being altered and the wardrobe being broken down, using that to represent how my name was being altered. And so I think it provided this safe space for me to explore my name while also acknowledge my complicity in it being shifted. It's not necessarily about the mispronunciation of the name because we all have different cultures and ways we say things, but it's more about the intention behind it. A thief comes into the house intending to steal and to break. That's very different from someone who maybe mistook the house for something else or went into the wrong door, came in, accidentally rearranged something that they didn't realize would be as much of a big deal for you. Those are two slightly different things. So, yeah, I think metaphors allow us to really explore things and discover new things within that as well.
Yes, that's right. For me, this poem really stood out in terms of expressing your boundaries because
Yeah, yeah.
this is my home and you're violating it by entering. It's a forbidden space for you and you're entering unlawfully, for example, when you give the example of the thief. And so it's very much about drawing your boundaries and drawing where you are willing for someone to alter something that is so precious to you and honoring your boundaries and honoring your God-given name and honoring who you are as a person
Yeah.
without having to bend over to be someone else or to fit into a different culture, a different heritage. So I really liked what the poems stood out for. So this was your first collection, right? Ceremony for the Nameless.
No, it's the second
The
Search of
second.
Equilibrium.
So that first collection was the grief poetry, is that
Yeah.
correct? And there was also a poem in there that really stood out for me, which was the one on your grandma and when she was dying.
Is it My Grandma Says She's Dying? Is that the poem you're referring to?
Yes, and it was funny because in my book I wrote a poem about my grandmother dying.
Oh God,
Wow,
really?
this might be a thing.
Wow,
But it
wow.
could be that we come from similar cultures. I also grew up in Kenya, so I have a bit of an African heritage as well. But having said that, I think from where we're coming from, our grandparents, the elders are so respected, and they're such a big part of who we are and how we're shaped in terms of our identity, our cultural values, etc. So when I was reading that poem in particular, it really reminded me of my own memories. In my book, I write about the memories of my grandmother and how they change over time as time
Mm.
passes, and how you remember them also changes. But I think yours is very much about how your grandma is so strong. That certainly stood out for me, even though she knows she's passing, she's dying slowly. That was beautiful. And I thought you had a second poem, In Search of Equilibrium, called Tailoring Grief. And
Yeah.
again, I felt that they're both poems that are quite helpful for grief because they don't hesitate to discuss the experience of grief and allow us to explore our own feelings around grief, which sometimes can feel either scary or threatening or too difficult to even think about. So it'd be interesting to see how you develop those poems as you were writing that and what you wanted the reader to perhaps experience when they were reading those poems, especially around grief, because I think poetry is a really excellent source of support
Mm.
for grief for people who are grieving. I use poetry a lot for grief and loss. So it'd be quite interesting to hear your perspectives on that.
I think it's one of those things where it's a process. There's never a destination that we get to. There is never, oh, we've answered how to handle grief. We've answered how to do this. And probably that's why I'm drawn to writing about it in poetry, because it's one of these colossal things that we experience in life. And poetry brings us one step closer to processing it and healing through it. And when I write, there's different ways I enter the poem. Sometimes it's just thinking about how it feels in our body and really just feeling it and acknowledging those experiences. So in tailoring grief, it opens with the tailor tells you you have to get measured to make sure grief fits right on your body. It's really exploring how does it feel in different parts of your body? How is it altering your body sensory wise? How is it moving through and how is it living in there? And poetry just roots those experiences in your body.
Yes,
And
and
the,
it's interesting about the personification of grief because you feel that personification helps to perhaps acknowledge it and be more willing to explore it.
Yeah, it acknowledges it, but it also opens your mind to how does it
Yeah.
really live with you? Because
Yes.
it's very easy to think about another person, how another person enters your house. And there's a poem about emotions being like guest visitors and how they live,
Yes.
what they take from you, how they interact
Yes.
with you. And
Yeah.
and so thinking about grief as a person or thinking about grief as this physical thing allows us to really think about where exactly it lives in our lives. It's easy to see something visible than something
Yes.
invisible. You can actually really see its weight, its shape, and all of those things. So, yeah, that definitely helps with poetry, but also thinking about the rhythm of grief. Rhythm is recurring patterns. And so, whether I use repetition in my work or alliteration, it's all thinking about what are the patterns in how I grieve? What are the
Yeah.
patterns that keep coming up? And how can language embody that in a way that really
Yes.
just acknowledging how is this moving through my life?
There's two things there, right? First, there's something about rhythm that allows us to process things and help us move forward. Like music therapy, there's something about rhythm that really helps us to process the emotions that we're feeling and stay with it.
Mm,
And then at the same time, what you said about how the grief is moving through our bodies, it makes it quite transient, almost allowing it to then eventually pass and leave your
yeah.
body without necessarily having to stay with it the whole time, and then shape shifting as well, perhaps into a different form that feels lighter on the body. So, yeah, it's interesting that the use of both of those tools in putting poetry in that format. A lot of your poetry seems to hit all these notes for therapeutic healing. But is that your goal with what you're writing? Is it meant to be a prompt for self-reflection and healing? All poetry does that to an extent, but I'm quite curious to know what your intention is when you're writing this poetry.
Mm, I rarely ever go into the poem to heal. I go into the poem for self-reflection. Healing is a byproduct of that because healing is not always immediate. The self-reflection comes first, and healing is in parts based on what is revealed through that process. When I'm writing, it's really thinking about what is the best tool, the best language or technique that can really help me explore the experience of this past the present. For example, I have this poem called Carousel of Oil Sheen, and it's talking about being here and finding a hair salon that reminds me of the joy of being in a hair salon in Lagos, the noise and the smell of oil sheen and all of these things. And the
Yeah.
best way I could do that was I wrote a mirror poem. So the poem can read forwards or backwards. And the poem exists in two pages, where the second page you read it backwards. And reading it the second time, I could almost capture that process of realizing that the present reminds you of this joyful experience in the past. So it's really
Yeah.
thinking about what can the poem do to help me capture the emotion, but also what are the set of images that could help me? Because it's not necessarily about just writing an experience, because if I'm writing an experience and that's a diary entry, that's not a poem or that's not poetic. But what poetry does is it takes the experience, it really knits together a set of images that captures it or recaptures it, because then that allows you to add and edit in ways that you're not as precious about as you would be if you were actually writing just straight about your own experience. For example, you mentioned about my grandmother say she's dying. I used the image of a trumpet to talk about just how colossal and vibrant her voice is, but also a trumpet represents biblically the end of something, this idea of it's very rapturous, like when the trumpet is sounded, the world ends. And so by bringing in my grandmother's voice as a trumpet, I can better explore and reflect on her life and reflect on what her ending means in our family and to me.
That's a really interesting choice of using the trumpet as well, because there's so much life in a trumpet and the noise and
Mhm.
the sound, and you feel so alive, but at the same time, it's the end of the journey as well. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that you've used that metaphor. It's brilliant. And I think in Nigerian heritage, you probably also look at the passing of an elderly person is really a celebration of life.
Yeah, it is. It's seen as a joyful thing.
Exactly. So it really does bring all those things together, which might otherwise need to be unpacked in prose.
Self-reflecting in poetry. You have
Yeah.
to go in with an openness.
I think you're absolutely right. You have that reflection piece, and then once you've reflected, then it's going back and reviewing and consolidating and
Mm,
sort of tying it all together to reach this closure or final thoughts on
yeah,
something. And I think that's really powerful. I love that technique of the mirror image and writing the poetry backwards and forwards. Again, through the use of the body and the space and the visuals, that does create in your mind a process for healing and therapy. So
yeah.
that's great. And you've also led many well-being and poetry projects. Hash My Mental Health Journey. And are you still involved in these initiatives?
Between 2019 to 2020, I was Young People's Laureate for London. And each
Amazing.
laureate in your tenure, you have something that you focus on. And I chose to focus on mental health. And so a lot of the initiatives that we did were in line with getting young people to have conversations around mental health in different ways. And so this initiative, I gave writing prompts, and so people would use the hashtag to share their poem online in safe ways. And it was an initiative in partnership with Young Minds. But that was really the beginning of me finding ways that I could talk about mental health and talk about our well-being through poetry. So that was one initiative. Continue to do other things, not to that scale, but in many ways, exploring the mind and exploring mental health through creative well-being workshops. That's something I've done. I did it for Croydon Borough. I did it for the National Literacy Trust, and it's mostly going into schools and using poetry as a way for young people to have conversations about their emotions because it can feel a lot safer to really reflect on themselves and reflect on your emotions as opposed to a standard mental health talk session, which both work hand in hand together. But poetry just allows them to feel it in their body and really think about who they are, how they're changing, and how their emotions respond to that. It's something that I still continue to do. And as you evolve artistically, you're always thinking about new ways that you can use poetry or use literature. But
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. For me, I call it creative bibliotherapy techniques, but it's the use of writing as well as reading to heal. I really feel that creativity is such a big part of the healing process, and I often
yeah,
feel that you can't have healing without some form of creativity. So
yeah,
I can totally understand those creative writing workshops to help young
yeah,
people explore their emotions in a safe way, to talk about things that they may not have the language for, don't feel safe talking about. So I think we need more of that, especially
mhm,
now with mental health in decline and children struggling with exposure to social media and the excessive demands that they have now with what they're exposed to. So I think something like a creative writing workshop, like across the national
definitely.
curriculum, would be so helpful.
Definitely. I love what you said, by the way, and it's going to stay with me is this healing cannot happen without some form of creativity. I just think that is just really beautiful and just captures life in general,
Yes, it really
beyond
does.
poetry.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's such a crucial part. And so when I work, I have to get people to do some sort of journaling and then either use poetry or narrative therapy or letter write, just something, even if it's just drawing a picture to heal. And for me, I often find that going to cultural spaces, like going to museums and or theatre, just awakens me and pulls me out of the low mood that I might be feeling. And then, of course, the conversations, the cultural experiences evoke are also a key part. So I think a lot of it's leveraging what you're creating or what you're reading or experiencing to then get you to that next place in your mind,
Mm.
post-processing of emotions. And you recently launched your own stationery brand called Your Envoi, which I think kind of ties in nicely with this ability to express how we're feeling or kickstart conversations, because I know it's a whole wellness brand around conversation starters and journaling and putting pen to paper. It might be interesting to hear a little bit about that and your inspiration behind it and what your goal is with the launch of the stationery brand.
I've really enjoyed the journey, and it's just an extension of what I am doing with poetry. And it's essentially using poetry inspired approaches to design tools that deepen self understanding and enrich our relationships. So it's really about self connection and social connection. So our first products are a guided journal and conversation cards. And it's all this poetry inspired approaches. It's really about poetic techniques and paying attention to ourselves, but also creativity. So the journal is for those seeking balance in their daily lives, busy professionals. And I've used the way rhythm is created in a poem to design a system for people to find rhythm in their daily lives. And it also includes guided prompts as well at the back, and it's curated with inspiring quotes from poems. While the conversation cards are creative and imaginative questions and insightful questions that really get people thinking and seeing themselves and their group of friends differently. I say friends, but it can be used with colleagues, strangers. I had someone get it for their wedding recently. So
Oh,
it's really
wow.
about how you want to use these things. But really, it's just getting people to slow down. And that's what poetry does. Literature in general, it gets us to slow down and make time to use words, to use creative words to really see ourselves in the world differently and discover things about ourselves and process emotions and also emerge with a bit more empathy for ourselves and others. Design is really for that intention, and it can be something simple as stationery, but it's somehow going to be infused with things that renew our mind. So whether it's art on the wall or greeting cards, all of these things go beyond the normal use of words. So I've really enjoyed the process and the response, and it just goes back to how can we take creative language and see how it lives in our world, in our everyday life. And so I'm thinking literally about objects that we use because poetry is all around us. It's inextricable to our daily life.
Does. Poetry makes life so much more colourful. And I also feel when you talk about these cards and journaling, etc., I feel like it's all about building connection with each other, connection to self, bringing in that creative element and slowing down. These are brilliant tools and are so needed right now. I'm
Yeah.
quite excited to get a set for myself and use them at home with my kids or with my friends when they come over. So I think that's wonderful and I can't wait to check them out.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you very much.
and lastly, before we end, I wanted to ask you, given that this is a bibliotherapy podcast, is there a book or a piece of literature that has had a significant impact on your life or that you could even say has been life-changing?
Ooh, the book I would pick that has been life-changing for me and remains one of my favorite books. It's The Dutch House by Anne Patchett.
That's a brilliant book.
Honestly, it follows two siblings who grow up in this mansion and are raised by their father. But life happens. Their mother had abandoned them years ago. Their father dies. Their father remarries before he dies. But after he dies, they find themselves kicked out of this home. But well into their 40s, they still drive to this place to stalk and observe their stepmother and the people who now live in this home and what their lives are like. And so this home represents their obsessions, their history, also inequality as well, because it's set towards the end of the World War. But really, the loss of this home represents the loss of their family. And rather than rebuilding their own home and their own life, they return there. And so it's something that really got me thinking about what are the things that we've lost that we're really not let go of? And because we haven't let go of those things, we hinder ourselves from rebuilding. And so their lives are stifled by this. Danny's kind of walking in his father's shoes, and despite studying medicine, he ends up doing what his father did. And Maeve just is working as an administrator. She never really goes beyond, and she just limits herself and doesn't really think about what can she do and offer the world. And even in little things, I'm really conscious about how am I hoarding objects at home? What am I so afraid to let go of? All these things
Yeah.
are a manifestation of how we feel internally.
Yes, I think it perfectly explores the boundary between loss and the will to move on because
Mm,
there's a space in between where we can just stay forever and never quite leave something and never quite embrace the future that might be even better. And it's that
yeah.
kind of fear of changing as well and fear of losing the unfamiliarity because with change is that loss that we have to experience. And with that loss comes all the complex emotions
Yeah.
that we have to grieve. And it's a beautiful metaphor. And it's no surprise to me that's your favorite book, given how much you write on grief poetry and given how helpful I think your grief poetry will be to others, especially because you've also read so widely around the subject. And I do think you capture that really well in your poems.
Oh, thank you. I
So,
really
I really wanted to say thank you so much for writing them and sharing them with the world and coming on and talking to us today. All of the things that you've mentioned, from the poetry to the conversation cards for Your Envoi and the guided journal, all of those things are going to be super helpful. I do hope people get a chance to get access to them and go out and grab a copy of the poetry collections as well. So, thank you. Thanks, Theresa. I really appreciate you coming on. And I'm looking forward to sharing this conversation with my listeners.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you'd like to sign up to our online courses or try a personalized book prescription or bibliotherapy session, you can do so following the links in the show notes. And as always, I love hearing from listeners, so don't hesitate to drop me an email at bidgel@booktherapy.io.